I first discovered Hawthorne Estates on a sweltering day in mid-July. A friend of mine, Bethany, mentioned that if I was looking for a new home, I should check out a place just outside the city. She said it had beautiful craftsman-style houses, tree-lined streets, and a friendly community, everything I'd ever wanted. At the time, I had no idea a neighborhood could hide so many secrets. Hawthorne Estates charmed me from the moment I arrived at the open house. Pale pink crepe myrtles bloomed along the sidewalks, and kids were racing bikes down the quiet roads. When I walked into what would become my house, an immediate sense of warmth filled me. The living room had a large bay window that poured in sunlight, and the back porch overlooked a small pond with a stone fountain. I thought, this could be my forever home. I met a few neighbors during that initial visit, too. They smiled warmly and offered to introduce me around if I decided to move in. They mentioned a very proactive homeowners association, HOA, but no one seemed too concerned about it. If anything, it sounded reassuring, like an organized, engaged community that cared about property values and neighborhood safety. With a respectable down payment, I purchased the home, and within 2 months, I was fully settled in. Yet almost immediately, subtle warning signs began appearing. Whispers about certain strict rules, rumors of overbearing leadership at the HOA, and, strangest of all, mention of a woman people called Karen, though her real name was something else entirely. I shrugged off most of these hints, figuring they were exaggerations from disgruntled folks who simply disliked following guidelines. After all, HOAs, while sometimes strict, generally want to keep everything tidy, right? Little did I know, this was no ordinary HOA. And the woman they nicknamed Karen was about to turn my life, and this entire neighborhood, upside down in ways I never could have predicted. It didn't take long before I met her face to face. On a sunny Saturday, I was out front pruning hedges, enjoying the mild weather and birdsong. That's when a silver crossover SUV pulled up, blocking my driveway. A middle-aged woman, short and lean, emerged. Her hair was styled in an immaculate bob, and she wore khaki slacks with a crisp, pale yellow blouse. Clutching a clipboard, she marched directly toward me. "Hi," I said, trying to be friendly. "Can I help you?" She pressed her lips together, glancing over her notes. "Might you be the owner of 118 Clover Hill Drive?" "Yes," I answered, straightening up. She offered a quick, perfunctory smile. "I'm Melissa Brewster, Vice President of the Hawthorne Estates Homeowners Association. Most neighbors call me Karen behind my back," she added, rolling her eyes. "I suppose it's meant to be an insult, but I don't let that bother me. I'm here to maintain standards." Something in her tone set me on edge. She seemed polite on the surface, yet her words and posture radiated authority and condescension. "Standards?" I echoed, wiping sweat off my brow. She shifted her clipboard to her other arm and scanned the yard. "Our covenants dictate that hedges in front yards must be uniformly trimmed to 40 inches. Yours appear closer to 44. We encourage residents to follow all guidelines. After all, compliance ensures property values remain high." I forced a small laugh. "I'll measure them again when I'm finished. Thanks for letting me know." She gave me another tight smile and nodded, then added, "We'll be conducting an election soon. There's an open seat for the HOA board. I might run for president, now that our longtime president is retiring. This neighborhood needs someone who won't let it slip into disarray." Before I could respond, she pivoted back to her SUV and drove away, leaving me standing amid trimmings, perplexed. That was how I officially met the person everyone secretly called Karen. Though that conversation was brief, her entire demeanor suggested she was used to having the final say in everything. Over the following weeks, I began noticing small signs that Karen was more than just an occasionally brusque neighbor. She was everywhere. I'd see her SUV slowly rolling down the street in the early evenings, as if patrolling for violations. I heard stories from neighbors about her micromanaging yard decor, mailbox styles, even the color of garden gnomes. A friend down the block, Travis, told me how she'd once left a note on his door, accusing him of undermining the aesthetic integrity of Hawthorne Estates because he planted sunflowers along the side of his house rather than the approved rosebushes. He ended up replanting to avoid an argument or a fine. But it was talk of the upcoming HOA board elections that really piqued my interest. Neighbors whispered about how Karen intended to ascend to the presidency. The current president, Mr. Hoffman, was an older gentleman who led with a light touch. He He was rumored to be stepping down for health reasons. Karen had apparently been his right-hand enforcer for years, but her approach was far more militant than his. At community gatherings, like the monthly Sunday potluck at the clubhouse, Karen would corner people and, in her faux-friendly manner, urge them to support the right candidate to keep property values strong. She made it sound like a caretaker's duty, but if I'm honest, it felt more like she was building a personal monarchy within the HOA. Many folks nodded along, hesitant to cross her openly, but behind her back they complained and worried about the day she'd tighten her grip. Through all this, I mostly kept my head down. I had a busy life, balancing my job and occasional side projects in the city. Since I'm a chief election official for our county, yes, ironically, I oversee local and county-level elections, I knew a thing or two about how ballots, votes, and official processes work. However, I kept that detail to myself. In my mind, it didn't matter that I oversaw elections professionally. I was just a neighbor who wanted to enjoy a peaceful environment. I had no clue that soon, my professional expertise would become the linchpin in exposing Karen's cunning scheme, one that would rattle Hawthorne Estates like never before. As autumn rolled in, the HOA election talk grew more intense. Yard signs appeared, mostly with generic slogans like "Keep Hawthorne Estates Great" or "For a Brighter Neighborhood." Some were obviously in support of Karen, though her name was never spelled out. Only "Vote MB for HOA President" in bold letters. Others belonged to two lesser-known residents, attempting to position themselves as alternatives. I remained neutral, or so I thought. My schedule was stacked with my real job's demands. Our county had just wrapped up a municipal election cycle, and now my office was focused on auditing results, ensuring compliance with state requirements, and preparing for the next wave of local ballots. Between that and personal life, I didn't see a reason to get deeply involved in the Hawthorne Estates board race. Still, I couldn't ignore the hush-hush tone creeping into my neighbors' conversations. People suspected Karen might not play fair. They told me how she had recently formed a so-called compliance committee, made up of a few of her friends. The official mission was to review any potential covenant violations before Election Day, apparently to demonstrate how dedicated she was to cleaning up the neighborhood. But my neighbor Carla confided that the committee's real function might be to intimidate those who questioned Karen's leadership. At community events, Karen would flaunt that compliance data, claiming she was the only candidate tough enough to protect property values. She'd point out a homeowner's chipped paint or a slightly leaning fence, chastising them publicly. Even if the person fixed the issue, she'd put them on a watch list. It was fear-mongering of the mildest suburban sort, but it worked. People dreaded her disapproval and dreaded fines even more. One evening, Carla half-jokingly asked me, "Do you think she might actually rig the HOA election?" I chuckled at first. I doubt it. Rigging votes in a small HOA election? That seems extreme. Carla shrugged, letting out a wary sigh. You never know. She's determined. And the system here isn't like county or state elections. It's all volunteer-run, mostly on an honor system. That planted a seed of worry in my mind. While tampering with a local HOA election might seem trivial compared to bigger political races, the consequences within the community could be substantial. It can shape how we all live day to day, our finances, fines, rules, and overall atmosphere. If the process was manipulated, Karen's reign would be absolute. The first real indication that something was off came from an unlikely source, Mr. Hoffman, the soon-to-be-retired HOA president. One crisp October afternoon, he dropped by my place, looking somewhat distraught. He took a seat on my porch swing, sipping the lemonade I offered. "You're new here," he said. "I don't want to overwhelm you with drama, but a few board members have approached me with concerns about how votes are being collected." I raised a brow. "What do you mean exactly?" He explained that in Hawthorne Estates, the HOA elections used mail-in ballots or in-person votes cast at the clubhouse. However, Karen had recently pushed for a more convenient system where she and her election oversight group would personally collect ballots from people's homes, just to save time. That group was mostly the same individuals on her so-called compliance committee. I wouldn't have agreed to that system, Hoffman sighed. But my health has kept me from overseeing as much as I'd like. Karen's been persuasive, telling me it's all about boosting participation. But now, I'm hearing rumors that some ballots might be disappearing or being replaced before they reach our official counters. I have no proof, just rumors. His expression was full of worry. He confided that while he thought about stepping in to stop it, his doctor strongly advised he reduce stress. The man was near 70, after all, and dealing with a heart condition. He didn't want to believe that Karen would stoop to electoral fraud, but he also knew that she was doggedly ambitious. Finally, Hoffman asked if I had any experience with election integrity. I heard you mention you work in government. Maybe you'd know how to make sure no one messes with the results. I hesitated. My position as chief election official was a serious, county-level job. I was more than capable of seeing through typical forms of fraud: fake ballots, tampering, miscounts, ballot harvesting. I took a breath and said, I do have some experience. How can I help? Relief flooded Hoffman's features. If you could keep an eye on it. Nothing official, just watch for irregularities. I feel silly even asking. But if there's wrongdoing, I want someone with knowledge to step in and correct it. I promised him I'd do my best. With that, the seasoned HOA president left. And so it began. I was about to apply my professional skills in a suburban microcosm, ensuring that Karen's hustle, if it existed, would be exposed. I started small, chatting with neighbors who were comfortable sharing their experiences. It didn't take long for me to hear a pattern of oddities. Mrs. Yu said 2 women from Karen's election oversight group came to collect her ballot. They insisted on waiting while she filled it out, explaining it was just to confirm your intent. Feeling pressured, Mrs. Yu quickly checked Karen's box, even though she wasn't sure that's who she wanted to support. She told me in a hushed tone that she'd felt bullied into it. The Montoya family reported that after they mailed their ballots, Karen herself called them, insisting there was a problem with the postage and that they needed to resend or hand-deliver a new ballot. Suspicious, they asked for details. Karen grew irritated and hung up. Tiffany Boyd, a young woman living in a rented townhome, mentioned she never received her ballot at all. When she tried to request another copy from the HOA, they told her it was too late. Countless similar stories surfaced. Some might be coincidences or just typical bureaucratic errors. Yet, taken together, they painted a sketchy picture of possible ballot tampering, intimidation, and confusion campaigns. Everything felt too orchestrated to be random. I also examined how ballots were securely stored. The official statement was that the collected ballots would be kept in a locked cabinet at the clubhouse, accessible only to the official counters. But from what I could gather, Karen had effectively become the gatekeeper. And that was a massive red flag. Quietly, I began documenting these incidents. I maintained meticulous notes and times, matching them with the testimonies from neighbors. Part of me questioned if I was overreacting. It was just an HOA election, not a congressional race. But the other part remembered that any form of vote manipulation was not only unethical but, depending on the methods, potentially illegal. At the very least, it certainly violated fair governance principles that even a small homeowners association should uphold. All the while, I maintained my facade as simply a concerned neighbor with a knack for organization. No sense in tipping Karen off that I dealt with far larger elections professionally. If she knew, she might clamp down or become more cunning. I couldn't allow that. One Sunday afternoon, I attended an HOA meeting to get a closer look at Karen's tactics in public. She was seated at a long table in the front of the clubhouse, flanked by 2 of her staunch allies. About 30 residents filled the chairs, restless and anxious for updates on everything from landscaping rules to, of course, the pending election. Karen cleared her throat and spoke in her signature clipped tone. Thank you all for coming. First item, we have an election update. Ballot collection is nearly complete, thanks to our dedicated volunteers. We anticipate announcing results next Saturday. Several hands shot up, including mine. She gave me a cautious nod. Yes. I stood. I was wondering if you could clarify the counting process. How and when will the ballots be tallied, and by whom? She looked momentarily flustered. The volunteers and I will handle that. We're adhering to the guidelines set forth by the HOA's founding documents. I pressed on politely. Given the significant stakes, do you plan to let any neutral observers be present during the count, just to ensure everything is handled correctly? Her jaw tightened. As I said, our volunteers are fully equipped to do this. If we invite every curious neighbor, we'll never finish. There's no need for outside observers. A few neighbors murmured in disapproval. Another person, Linda, raised her hand. I mailed my ballot. Then I got a call saying they didn't receive it. But I used the correct address. Is there a record of which ballots have arrived? Karen forced a thin smile. Of course. We track them meticulously. If there was confusion, it might be the postal system's fault. There is no problem on our end. The tension was palpable. Karen's veneer of control was a little shaky, but she refused to concede an inch. After the meeting, I tried to chat with her casually, but she brushed me off with a curt, "No time to talk, sorry." Then she left with her small entourage. Despite the frustration, that meeting confirmed my suspicions. Karen had no intention of letting an independent observer see the ballots. She also seemed to be gaslighting neighbors who questioned her processes. It was time for me to take the next step, examining those guidelines that she claimed authorized her approach. If I found any violation of the HOA's own bylaws, or even local regulations, we might have enough to force a fair count. Hawthorne Estates had a thick binder of governing documents, covenants, conditions, restrictions, and a set of bylaws for how the HOA board should function. I managed to track down a copy at our local library's reference section. Apparently, each neighborhood filed a copy of its bylaws with the county clerk. I spent several evenings poring over the text. The language wasn't always straightforward, but I'm accustomed to legalese. Key points stood out. Ballot collection. The bylaws did not explicitly address house-to-house ballot pickup. Instead, they stated that members could vote in person at a designated meeting or submit absentee ballots by mail, to be received and logged by a neutral board secretary. Election oversight. The bylaws required that at least 2 neutral parties be present during the count. Neutral was defined as individuals who were not running for any position and had no direct relationship to the candidates. Transparency. A list of the votes received was supposed to be published by unique ballot ID, not by name, so members could verify that their ballot had been recorded. Karen's approach violated nearly all these points. She had no board secretary doing the official logging. She'd taken that job upon herself and her volunteers. As for the count, she clearly didn't plan to have neutral parties around. Most glaringly, the house-to-house pickup system was nowhere in the official bylaws. While the docs didn't forbid it outright, they certainly indicated a much more careful chain of custody. I typed up my findings in a concise report, referencing the bylaws by article and section. This gave me some solid ground to stand on if Karen tried to brush me off again. But I knew that confronting her directly wouldn't suffice. She might just keep ignoring me, or worse, destroy evidence of tampering before the final announcement. I needed one more piece of the puzzle, an inside look at the actual ballots, or at least confirmation from someone close to Karen's circle that she was rigging the process. Otherwise, she'd simply accuse me of slander and wave away any allegations as baseless. Sometimes in life, the right ally appears at just the right time. Mine came in the form of Danielle, a hesitant young woman who rang my doorbell one rainy evening. She was drenched, clutching a folder under her jacket. At first, I barely recognized her. She was one of Karen's new recruits on the election oversight group, someone I'd seen in passing but never really spoken to. "Hi," she said, looking over her shoulder nervously. "Can I come in? I need to talk." I ushered her inside, offering a towel and a cup of hot tea. Once she settled, she explained, "I know you're new here, but I've seen you at meetings. You seem reasonable, and, well, I can't keep quiet anymore." I gave a slow nod. "About the election?" She nodded, eyes wide. "Karen's telling us to do things that seem really wrong. Like, if someone marks their ballot for another candidate, we're encouraged to set it aside." Then she said she'd correct it. My stomach flipped. She's literally discarding or changing people's votes. Danielle pressed her lips together. She says that people don't know what's best for the neighborhood. She claims she's saving them from bad decisions. I didn't sign up for fraud. I just wanted to volunteer to help the HOA. But this is far beyond that. Her voice trembled as she continued. "I have some proof." She opened the folder to reveal copies of internal emails and instructions from Karen. They included lines like, "Ensure ballots with questionable marks are flagged for review. Do not count them unless verified by me personally. And, if ballots seem invalid, log them as spoiled and discard." I gently took the papers, scanning them with a mixture of anger and relief. These were explicit directives for tampering, a smoking gun, if you will. "Have you shown anyone else?" I asked. She shook her head vigorously. "No. I'm worried Karen will retaliate." She's well-connected. She brags about knowing realtors, local officials. She even threatened to raise our HOA fees if we go against her. But I can't just stand by and let her steal the election. I placed a reassuring hand on hers. Thank you for trusting me. Your testimony and these documents are crucial. With your permission, I'd like to use them to expose this fraud. I'll also make sure you're protected. There are whistleblower provisions in many states that can help, even in an HOA setting. Tears of relief welled in her eyes. Yes, please. I just want to do the right thing. That night, as thunder rumbled outside, we discussed the next steps. With Danielle's evidence, I finally had enough to force a fair election or, at the very least, block Karen's power grab. The question was, how to do so without letting her destroy more ballots or launch a wave of intimidation. Armed with Danielle's documents, plus my own bylaw analysis, I knew I had a solid case. But it wasn't enough to merely confront Karen in another chaotic HOA meeting. She'd either deny everything or spin it as a personal vendetta. Instead, I needed a plan to ensure ballot preservation. If Karen caught wind of an imminent challenge, she might destroy or alter ballots even more aggressively. I had to secure them before she had a chance. Independent verification. The community needed to see a fair, transparent counting process. That meant organizing neutral observers who were recognized and trusted, or at least ensuring the existing bylaw requirement of 2 neutral counters was properly enforced. Legal recourse. If Karen resisted or tried to stonewall, I need to escalate to local authorities or even civil court. And as chief election official for the county, I knew the relevant statutes about vote tampering, though those typically applied to public elections, not private HOAs. Still, many states have laws preventing even private organizations from engaging in blatant fraud. I reached out to Mr. Hoffman, detailing the basics, without revealing Danielle's identity. He was shocked, but not entirely surprised. He agreed to call an emergency HOA meeting to address procedural irregularities, scheduling it just 2 days before the official results were to be announced. That would hopefully corner Karen into dealing with the issue publicly, without letting her finalize or toss ballots first. Meanwhile, I discreetly contacted a friend in the local legal community, a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. She advised me that if we could prove Karen's tampering, the courts could invalidate the election results. In some rare cases, they might even impose fines or remove the fraudster from the HOA board. Lastly, I assembled a small group of neighbors I trusted, Carla, Linda, and Travis among them, to help gather statements. The plan was for them to stand up at the emergency meeting and share their experiences, lost ballots, intimidation, or suspicious phone calls. We wanted to show the entire membership that this wasn't just 1 or 2 disgruntled homeowners, but a widespread pattern. I hoped Karen would be too overconfident to see us coming. She had grown complacent, used to bullying or deceiving people one by one. But a public showdown, backed by evidence, might finally reveal who she really was. That Wednesday evening, the old clubhouse was unusually crowded, with nearly 60 residents packed inside. A hush fell as Mr. Hoffman stepped up to the podium, looking pale yet resolute. Karen sat off to one side, arms folded, frowning. Several of her close allies were there, wearing identical expressions of annoyance. Hoffman cleared his throat. Good evening, everyone. I've convened this emergency meeting to address concerns about our election process. Some neighbors have reported irregularities. Before he could continue, Karen leapt to her feet. This is ridiculous, she snapped, her voice echoing. The election is almost finished. We don't need baseless accusations now. People are only trying to sabotage the results because they fear I'll win. A few of her supporters mumbled agreement, but I stepped forward. Ms. Brewster, I said calmly, there is documented evidence suggesting ballots have been mishandled. We'd like you to explain certain discrepancies before the final count. Karen's eyes flicked to me, narrowing. Explain what exactly? I've done nothing out of the ordinary. I glanced at Hoffman, who nodded, giving me the go-ahead. Swiftly, I pulled out the copies of emails and instructions that Danielle had provided, careful not to reveal Danielle's name directly. In these directives, you ask your volunteers to set aside any ballot that doesn't favor you, labeling them as spoiled. You also instruct them to wait while residents fill out ballots, then urge them to choose you. Would you like to comment? A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Karen's face went white, then red. Those are private communications taken out of context. You have no right. They're related to an HOA election, I said. So they're subject to review if there's credible suspicion of wrongdoing. I also have the Hawthorne Estates bylaws here, which clearly state that ballots must be either mailed to the board's secretary or placed in a secure ballot box at the clubhouse. You took it upon yourself to collect them door to door, correct? She tried to regain composure. The bylaws don't forbid door-to-door collection. I was simply helping people. A neighbor, Linda, stood up next. You called me to say my ballot was lost, then insisted I fill out a second one in front of your friend. That's not by the book at all. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Mr. Hoffman took over. We can't proceed to finalize election results until this matter is cleared. I propose that we... Suddenly, Karen slammed her palm on the table. No, this is a witch hunt. The fact is, you're all ungrateful. I'm the only one who truly cares about preserving property values here. And you, she pointed at me, are meddling where you don't belong. A ripple of tension spread through the room, but the tide was clearly turning against her. The neighbors were outraged by the evidence, and her combative attitude did nothing to win them back. After a moment, Hoffman's voice came softly but firmly over the clamor. Ms. Brewster, the board will now vote on whether to suspend your involvement in the election. Then, we will find a proper, neutral method to count the ballots. Karen's face contorted with anger. You can't do this to me, Hoffman. You're not even going to be president anymore. Who are you to decide anything now? I took a step closer to the podium. Up to this point, I'd kept the nature of my profession mostly under wraps, but now seemed the time to unveil that I was more than a typical resident. Ms. Brewster, I said, voice steady. I happen to be the chief election official for this county. I oversee compliance with election protocols, ensuring fairness and accuracy in every ballot-based contest I handle. While the HOA election isn't part of my public jurisdiction, I am intimately familiar with the standards and laws that govern ballot security. And from what I've seen, you've willfully violated nearly every principle of a fair vote. There was a collective gasp. Several people whispered among themselves, clearly surprised. Karen's reaction was stark. Her mouth parted, and she stared at me in disbelief. Why, you work in elections? She sputtered. Yes, I answered. Legitimate elections. Ones where ballots aren't tampered with, and every voter's intent is respected. Based on the bylaws and the evidence we have, you're disregarding transparency, interfering with ballot custody, and instructing your volunteers to coerce or even discard certain votes. Karen's eyes darted around, probably weighing her options: deny, deflect, or make a run for it. Finally, she jutted her chin up defiantly. This is an HOA, not a county or state election. Your fancy title doesn't apply here. I gave her a cool nod. That may be so, but fraud is fraud, whether it's at the local, state, or even at an HOA level. The membership has a right to a fair process, and many states have laws prohibiting private organizations from engaging in election misconduct. Plus, your own bylaws demand transparency. If you refuse to comply, it could be grounds for a civil suit or even criminal penalties, depending on the severity. For a moment, Karen looked as though she might erupt in fury again, but the weight of the entire room's gaze pressed upon her. People began murmuring about lawsuits, property values dropping if the HOA collapsed in scandal, and the possibility of fines. Finally, she slumped back in her chair, her voice devoid of its usual bravado. Fine. If you want to poke your nose into everything, go ahead. Count the ballots however you want. I'm sure I'll still come out on top. Her words were bitter, but the fight had drained from her. The board took an immediate vote, 4-1 in favor of removing Karen's authority over the election. Mr. Hoffman and the others asked if I could help organize a transparent count. Though I'm rarely one to volunteer for extra duties, I knew it was necessary to restore trust in our community. Of course, I said. I'll need 2 neutral volunteers, neighbors who aren't on the ballot nor close to Karen, to assist. And we'll need to lock down the existing ballots immediately. No one objected. The meeting ended in a swirl of chatter. Karen lingered briefly, glaring at me with an expression that hovered between hatred and grudging respect. Then she stormed out, letting the door slam behind her. The lines were clearly drawn now. We'd either expose the full extent of her meddling or watch her attempt one more desperate ploy to keep power. My hope was that a fair count would settle matters once and for all. The next morning, I arrived at the clubhouse bright and early, accompanied by two neighbors whom everyone respected for their impartiality. Mr. Morales, a retired accountant, and Ms. Larson, a schoolteacher known for her fairness. Both had volunteered to help me ensure a clean, by-the-book process. As soon as we entered, we headed straight for the storage room where ballots were supposedly locked away. One of Karen's allies, Sasha, was there, looking uncertain. She had a key to the metal filing cabinet. When I explained our intention to review the ballots for security purposes, she hesitated but finally unlocked it under our watchful eyes. The inside was a mess. Envelopes labeled with addresses were mixed with others that lacked any notation. Some ballots were rubber-banded together with pink post-it notes reading invalid or check signature. Dozens more were piled haphazardly in the corner. In total, we counted about 400 ballots, though the community had well over 500 properties, meaning not everyone had voted yet, or perhaps some ballots were still in the mail. Immediately, I could see signs of tampering. Some envelopes were slit open. Others had scribbles that might indicate corrections or overwrites. My stomach twisted with anger, but I channeled that energy into methodical analysis. We began carefully sorting them. Category A, ballots still sealed in the official envelope, with no sign of tampering. Category B, opened envelopes with ballots inside that appeared unaltered. Category C, opened envelopes with suspicious markings, crossouts, or missing signatures. Within an hour, we had them triaged. About half the ballots were sealed or seemingly untouched. The rest bore irregularities. I meticulously documented each anomaly: date received, envelope condition, reason for suspicion, etc. Karen made a brief appearance mid-morning, glaring at us from the doorway, but not daring to interfere directly. I suspected she knew that any blatant interference now might result in immediate legal consequences. Instead, she just scoffed, then marched away. By day's end, Mr. Morales, Ms. Larson, and I had a plan to contact each household with a questionable ballot to verify if they intended any changes. It wasn't a perfect method. Some folks might not respond promptly, but it was the fairest approach we could devise. We'd give them a short window to clarify the status of their ballot. If they said the ballot had been tampered with, we'd allow them to submit a fresh one. It was tedious, borderline chaotic, but it was the best shot at unearthing the truth of each vote. Through it all, I felt an odd sense of purpose. This was precisely what I did on a larger scale for official government elections, but now I was applying the same rigor to my own neighborhood. It was personal. The next few days were a flurry of phone calls, emails, and in-person visits from residents. Many were livid to discover that their ballots had been labeled spoiled or invalid by Karen's group without any legitimate reason. Others were furious that Karen's volunteers had pressured them into voting in a certain way. A handful of folks had no idea any of this was happening at all. They just assumed the election was routine. Word spread quickly through Hawthorne Estates. Some neighbors took to social media, posting things like "Karen's corruption exposed" or "Our votes matter. No more dirty tactics." It was intense, and if I'm honest, it stoked a small fear in me that the situation could become too heated. As an election official, I'm accustomed to hot tempers when results are contested, but this was the place I slept at night. I didn't want open hostility on my doorstep. Still, it was heartening to see how many residents rallied for a fair process. They lined up in support of the recount we were organizing and demanded that Karen step down from her role if found guilty of wrongdoing. Even some of her former supporters began to distance themselves, claiming they had no idea she was bending the rules this badly. The only person remaining conspicuously silent was Karen herself. She'd gone from daily patrols of the neighborhood to rarely showing her face. Some claimed they spotted her SUV cruising late at night, as if she were looking for trouble. But no direct confrontation occurred. The tension built to a crescendo on the final day of the verification process. That's when we posted a notice at the clubhouse and on the community website. The final vote count, open to all residents to watch, would occur on Saturday at noon in the clubhouse main hall. All ballots not confirmed as valid by 11:59 p.m. Friday will be set aside. The notice read, "Pending further verification." A moment of truth was fast approaching, one that would either vindicate the community's faith in democracy or leave Karen in control if, by some twist, enough ballots were still in her favor. None of us knew exactly how it would end. Saturday dawned bright and hot. By 11:30 a.m., neighbors were streaming into the clubhouse. There was an air of grim anticipation, punctuated by whispered conversations. Karen hadn't made an official statement, but her supporters and her detractors were out in force. We had 3 large tables arranged in front. On one table sat the verified ballots, category A and B, neatly stacked and labeled. On another lay the suspicious ballots, category C, organized by address. On the third table were resubmitted or clarified ballots from those who responded to our inquiries. A projector screen displayed a live tally spreadsheet for transparency. At noon sharp, Mr. Hoffman welcomed everyone. Today, we are concluding the election for HOA president. We will count all ballots that have been verified. In the spirit of fairness, we're allowing 2 observers from the community to watch the count up close. Those observers were Ms. Davis and Mr. Patel, 2 homeowners known for their integrity, neither of whom was running for office or connected to Karen. The counting process began. Mr. Morales and Ms. Larson opened each sealed ballot or envelope, read out the vote for the presidency, and handed it to me. I'd mark it on the spreadsheet. 1 vote for Karen, labeled as MB, or 1 vote for the other 2 candidates, Mr. Vincent and Ms. Riley. Occasionally, I'd encounter a ballot that was ambiguous, either due to a marking error or an unreadable name. Those were set aside as uncertain, and we took a consensus vote with the observers to decide if the intention was clear enough to count. At first, the atmosphere was tense, but as we proceeded ballot by ballot, the tension broke into little gasps or murmurs each time a new vote was read. An odd pattern emerged. Whenever we counted one of the previously spoiled ballots that had been resubmitted, it was almost always a vote against Karen. That confirmed Danielle's account that she'd been marking opposing votes as invalid. Karen hovered in the back of the room, arms folded, face grim. She sometimes whispered sharply to Sasha, but never made a formal objection. At times, her expression twisted into fleeting panic whenever we announced a batch of votes for Mr. Vincent or Ms. Riley. Eventually, after nearly 2 hours, we reached the end of the verified ballots. I tallied them up. Mr. Vincent, 180 votes. Ms. Riley, 130 votes. Karen, MB, 118 votes. Uncertain/invalid, 15 votes. It wasn't even close. Mr. Vincent had the clear lead. Even if all 15 uncertain ballots magically went to Karen, she'd still lose by a wide margin. Mr. Hoffman approached the mic. Based on these results, it appears Mr. Vincent will be our new HOA president. Any objections? Karen's voice cut through the room. This is a sham. All these last-minute validations were done under her direction. She pointed at me, anger flaring. I lifted the spreadsheet printout. We simply followed the bylaws to ensure that if a ballot was tampered with, the voter could confirm their real intent. That's the core principle of fair elections. A few scattered cheers erupted, and 1 or 2 people clapped. It wasn't an overwhelmingly joyous scene. There was too much bitterness in the air. But it was relief, nonetheless, for those who feared Karen would manipulate the final outcome. Karen's face paled as the crowd recognized that her months of intimidation and tampering had come to nothing. To me, though, the final blow was still to come: accountability. Would she just sulk away, or face consequences for her deliberate fraud? Once the excitement over Mr. Vincent's victory died down, people began directing pointed questions at Karen. They'd either been suspicious for a long time or recently discovered how their ballots had been mishandled. A small circle formed around her near the back of the clubhouse. "You owe us an explanation," someone demanded. "Is it true you told your volunteers to throw out ballots against you?" asked another. Karen stood stiffly, her eyes darting around in search of an exit. "I did what was necessary to keep the neighborhood in top shape. You all want things easy. But do you know how quickly property values can plunge if we don't maintain strict standards? I've seen it happen. I was protecting all of you." A neighbor scoffed. "Don't spin this. You had no right to rig votes." She tried to push past them, but the circle closed in. More voices joined the fray. "You threatened to fine me for painting my fence a different shade, all because I wouldn't support you." My 80-year-old mother felt pressured when your volunteers hovered over her while she filled her ballot. Karen's composure shattered. "Yes, I pressured people to vote for me. Yes, I tried to disqualify ballots for the opposition. But you'll thank me one day when home values skyrocket. I've put in countless hours ensuring the color schemes are uniform, that no one's yard becomes an eyesore, that the entire community remains coveted by prospective buyers. Can any of you claim that dedication?" Her voice rose to a near shout, and the crowd recoiled in a mix of shock and disgust. Mr. Hoffman, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward gently. "Ms. Brewster, it's time for you to step away. The membership can decide further actions to address your violations of our bylaws." She glared at him, tears of anger welling in her eyes. "You're all ungrateful. I never meant for it to go this far, but it did, because none of you see the bigger picture." No one responded. She finally pushed through the onlookers and stormed out the door. Sasha trailed behind, looking embarrassed. An uneasy silence settled over the clubhouse. That silence broke when Carlos said, "So, is she just going to walk away from all this?" Mr. Vincent, the newly elected president, stepped toward us. "She'll have to answer for her actions. Our bylaws allow for the board to hold a disciplinary hearing, or we can take it to the courts if necessary. Her attempts to tamper with votes might even violate state fraud statutes." Even though Karen had left, the ramifications of her scheme lingered in the air. Yet there was also a sense of resolution, as though the community had just woken up from a bad dream. We had a new president, a fair election, and a unified front determined not to let Karen's bullying resume. Over the following weeks, Hawthorne Estates gradually returned to normal, at least a new normal, shaped by awareness of how close we came to losing our voice. Mr. Vincent set about reorganizing committees in a more democratic fashion. He established a small election reform task force to codify stricter procedures for future votes. Mandatory sealed ballots dropped at a secure lockbox, monitored by more than one board member, and fully open counting sessions with public observers. I sat in on one of the task force meetings, offering my expertise. Though my official job is with the county, I was glad to volunteer time here. If I could prevent even small-scale fraud within my own neighborhood, it was worth it. Karen, meanwhile, had vanished from most public gatherings. Some reported seeing her SUV in the driveway at odd hours. Occasionally, she'd appear in the grocery store, ignoring neighbors' attempts to say hello. Word around the block was that she'd sought legal counsel to defend against potential charges or lawsuits. No one knew the details yet, whether she'd be fined, forced to resign from the HOA board entirely, or even face civil litigation. Despite the bitterness, I sensed a strange undercurrent of empathy among some neighbors. They recognized that while Karen's methods were deplorable, her obsession with property values might have stemmed from a deep-seated insecurity or fear of losing control. That didn't excuse the fraud, of course, but it offered a morsel of understanding. We all have flaws. Karen's just led her down a path of destructive meddling. Meanwhile, I continued my usual life, working at the county election office, going for morning runs around the pond, chatting casually with neighbors about their children, gardens, or holiday plans. The tension that once filled the air at Hawthorne Estates was easing. On weekends, we even saw families hosting barbecues in their backyards. It felt like the neighborhood was reclaiming its identity, free from the grip of a single, forceful personality. At the same time, I knew we had to be vigilant. Power vacuums could invite new problems. Yet, as the local autumn leaves turned red and gold, there was a distinct sense of renewal in Hawthorne Estates. A month later, the Karen situation took a decisive turn. Several homeowners who felt personally aggrieved by Karen's fraudulent tactics decided to file a civil suit against her, claiming damages for emotional distress and potential financial harm. For instance, anyone who faced threatened fines or lost a home sale because of her meddling. Additionally, the HOA's official board decided to bring an internal disciplinary action against her. I received a subpoena asking for records or evidence of ballot tampering. Since Danielle had confided in me, and we had real proof, I was obliged to comply. I provided carefully redacted versions of the documents to protect Danielle's identity as best as I could. Even so, her name might come out if the case went to court. Despite that risk, Danielle told me she was determined to testify if needed. She has to be held accountable, she insisted one day over coffee. I'm tired of being scared. During a preliminary hearing, Karen's attorney tried to argue that the HOA bylaws were unclear and that my role in the recount had been improperly intrusive. The judge, looking unimpressed, noted that private associations are still bound by their own charters and by basic principles of fair dealing. He scheduled a full hearing for a few weeks later, allowing the lawsuit to proceed. In the meantime, the HOA board convened a special session to consider whether to remove Karen from her seat as vice president. Mr. Vincent led the session. The board members weighed the evidence of her wrongdoing, testimonies, emails, manipulated ballots, and unanimously voted to strip her of any official position in the association. Furthermore, they barred her from running for any board seat for the next 5 years. When the board announced its decision at the next open forum, a wave of applause filled the clubhouse. Some neighbors who had once feared Karen's reprisal now stood up and publicly voiced relief that the community was no longer under her tight grip. Karen herself was not present. She'd stopped attending any official gatherings. A few folks said she might be selling her home and moving away. Others speculated she would stay put out of sheer stubbornness, refusing to let anyone force her out. Regardless, she was now effectively a non-entity in terms of HOA governance. By early winter, the drama had largely dissipated. The new HOA president, Mr. Vincent, introduced friendlier policies, focusing on neighborly cooperation rather than draconian enforcement. He formed committees for beautification, safety, and social events, each led by volunteers who genuinely wanted to contribute. The vibe around Hawthorne Estates felt lighter, more inclusive. A small, satisfying wave of normalcy had returned. The year-end holidays were approaching, and the neighborhood sparkled with festive lights. People smiled at each other in the street, collectively exhaling after the tense election fiasco. The lawsuit against Karen was still pending. Civil cases can drag on, but it no longer dominated everyday conversation. Instead, neighbors talked about potlucks, winter events, or casual get-togethers. The sense of gloom had lifted. One evening, as I strolled back from a neighborhood potluck, a gentle snow began to fall. I paused under a street lamp, recalling the hectic days of rummaging through tampered ballots, hearing frightened neighbors' stories, and confronting Karen at that emergency meeting. It all felt like a fever dream. Yet, it also reaffirmed what I believe in most strongly: the integrity of elections, no matter how small. I realized then that my involvement had made a tangible difference. Sometimes, living by our principles means stepping outside our usual boundaries, like taking my county-level expertise and using it here in a modest suburban microcosm. Maybe that's what communities need most: people who stand up for fairness when it really counts. A week before Christmas, I received an unexpected knock on my door. When I opened it, Karen stood there, bundled in a heavy coat, eyes downcast. My immediate reaction was concern. Was she here to lash out? Accuse me of something? She cleared her throat, voice quieter than I'd ever heard. I just wanted to say. She hesitated as though the words tasted bitter. I'm sorry. I said nothing, letting her continue. She shuffled her feet in the snow. I know I messed up. I let it get personal. The property values, the fear of letting the neighborhood slip. I went too far. You just had to get involved and ruin my plans. She paused, her features pinching in conflict. I mean, you exposed me. Rightfully so. Her apology wasn't entirely gracious, but it was more than I ever expected from her. Thank you, I said carefully. I'm sorry things came to this point, but your actions really hurt people. They had to be stopped. A flicker of frustration crossed her face, but then it softened. Maybe I should move away and start fresh. Or maybe I'll stay here, keep my head down for a while. Either way, I won't bother anyone again. The lawsuit is a headache, but, well, I'll deal with it. I just wanted you to hear me say sorry. We stood there in the cold silence for a moment. Then she gave a small nod and walked off. I closed the door, exhaling. It wasn't a neat, perfect resolution, life seldom is. But perhaps it was a step in the right direction for her to face what she had done. After the holidays, the civil suit inched forward. Most neighbors half expected Karen to settle out of court. Sure enough, by March, she reached a settlement with the plaintiffs. Details were private, but whispers suggested she agreed to pay modest damages to the families she threatened or whose ballots she interfered with. In return, they dropped the case. The suit's conclusion ended the last major piece of the Karen saga. For the community, it felt like closure. We had a reformed HOA structure, a new president, and clarity that no single individual could hijack the association for personal gain again. Although Karen had apologized, I knew trust would be slow to rebuild, if she stayed at all. Some neighbors said she quietly put her house on the market. Others believe she might hold on to it as a rental property. Either way, her influence had dissipated. In many ways, that was the best outcome anyone could hope for. Meanwhile, day-to-day life at Hawthorne Estates continued in that gentle rhythm of suburban normalcy. Kids catching the school bus, joggers waving at each other in the early morning, people greeting at mailboxes. That spring, the daffodils and tulips sprouting up felt symbolic of a renewed sense of collective harmony. One sunny Saturday in April, the neighborhood organized a small celebration to mark a new beginning. It wasn't officially called an anti-Karen party, of course, but it was understood that we were celebrating our fresh start. New board, new sense of unity. The park by the pond was decorated with balloons and streamers. Families laid out blankets on the grass, potluck dishes piled high on tables. Mr. Vincent gave a short speech about moving forward with neighborly kindness and accountability. He specifically thanked the volunteers who helped conduct the final ballot count. Carla and Linda teased me, saying I was the big hero for using my election official superpowers. I laughed and insisted that the real heroes were all the neighbors who spoke up. In my eyes, the entire community's collective push for fairness was what defeated Karen's rigged election. Music played, kids tossed frisbees, and the air was filled with laughter. A sense of relief pervaded every corner of the gathering, like a weight had been lifted. While we'd never be a perfect community, we had proven we could stand together to protect our collective voice. Eventually, the sun dipped, painting the sky in soft pink and orange hues. I lingered by the pond, watching the water reflect the pastel colors. A wave of contentment washed over me. Hawthorne Estates was truly my home now, not just a place I bought a house. And every day, it felt a little brighter without the shadow of Karen's overreach. Months later, life continued on a promising track. The new HOA guidelines for elections were codified, ensuring that each subsequent vote would remain transparent. Any future unscrupulous candidate would find it impossible to do what Karen had tried. Though no one could predict if Karen might re-emerge in some capacity, for the moment, she'd receded from daily community affairs. By all accounts, she was paying for her misdeeds, both financially and socially. Perhaps she'd one day learn from it all, maybe even rejoin the neighborhood in good faith. But if not, Hawthorne Estates would endure. I sometimes reflected on how many people, upon hearing HOA drama, roll their eyes, imagining petty squabbles. But what we experienced showed me how genuinely high the stakes can be, even in a small-scale election. The rules that hold a community together can be shredded by a single self-righteous individual if no one stands up. Fortunately, we did stand up, and we did so together. On a warm summer evening not long after, I watched the sun set from my porch. Fireflies flickered in the yard. Kids played hide-and-seek down the street, their laughter echoing under the lamplight. No ominous SUV patrolling. No intimidation. No illusions of unstoppable power by a single Karen. Just a peaceful neighborhood, content to be itself. As for me, I carried on with my career, ensuring free and fair elections for the broader county. Yet now, whenever I gave a talk on election integrity, I'd think privately of Hawthorne Estates. It was a reminder that democracy, big or small, thrives when people refuse to be bullied or deceived. And that, perhaps, is the happiest ending of all, a neighborhood discovering that real power lies in the community's collective will and honesty. By joining forces, we overcame deception and restored trust, a victory that resonates far beyond a single HOA's borders, proving that integrity can triumph anywhere, so long as good people refuse to yield.